Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to this YouTube video today. I'm very excited to share with you what To-Yarrow brings. So today we're going to be discussing how climate change is going to change the game for sustainable gardening practices and how we might have to adapt as gardeners, herbalists, botanists, any enjoyer of plant in our understanding of these plant populations and how to cultivate them. But when we're talking about sustainability, that's a pretty broad word. So I'd like to kind of take this moment to have a few volunteers who might be brave enough to speak up and let me know what sustainability means to you. Kind of mull that over in your head, because I think everyone sort of has their own definition of what sustainability means and what that might look like for them. And I'm going to tell you my philosophy on that, but I also wanted to just go ahead and share this beautiful photo from one of our garden sites on campus. This is from our garden commons, and we've gotten a lot of beautiful harvests from it this year. You can see the wealth of tomatoes that we've had, and we used those for our salsa party at the beginning of orientation this year. So just wanted to sort of share some of my experiences from U of L with you. But one of the main takeaways I've gotten from my time at the University of Louisville is an analogy called the seat of sustainability. And for me, this is a really impactful philosophy because it's a perfect sort of analogy or metaphor for the balance you need for sustainability, for gardening, for taking care of our planet. So what does that balance look like? Let's take a moment to step away from plants and think about carpentry for a moment. I know very different fields, but I think the first thing, stool building 101 would probably mean that you need to know that stool legs have to be even. Take this world's smallest stool for an example. We have 3 legs and it's able to sit completely flat, if I keep my hand steady enough, because these 3 legs are all the same length. So we have a very balanced seat here. When we're talking about sustainability, the legs of this seat have a lot of importance because they're what is bolstering our sustainability. And each leg represents an important facet that we have to remember to keep in mind. One of them is the economy, one is equity, and one is the environment. So we also refer to it as the 3 E's. And it's important for sustainability to remember the impact that all 3 of these factors have. If we're solely focusing on how climate change would impact plant populations, how they'll change because of that, we're not getting the big picture. Because as gardeners, as plant caretakers, that's going to impact how we take care of our plants. So people are impacted as well. And based off of, your upbringing, where you're living, access to plants and to healthy, nutritious food that comes from these gardens can become even more limited and can become even more expensive as our plant populations change where they're basically native or best grown in. It might be more difficult to get your hands on some of the foods that would be normal staples in your diet. So you can see the economic factor coming into play there, as well as how people will have to respond to these. So just remember, as we go through this discussion, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the environment, but we still have to keep in mind the economy and our equity. But without further ado, I would love to tell you a little bit more about how climate change will impact our environment. So let's ask ourselves, why would climate change matter to us? Why would climate change impact gardening? And there are a lot of different ways that it will bring some changes. One of the first ones would be that plants are going to see faster life cycles. They're going to mature quicker, but also produce less. So you're going to have some decreased yields as well. And one of the main factors for that is because nitrogen, a really important mineral for plants, is going to be less available. So our plants won't even be able to get as big. And they're gonna be hungry. In the face of hotter temperatures, they're gonna want some water, just as you and I would. So you're going to see longer and warmer growing seasons, so you're gonna have to spend more time, energy, and water taking care of these plants. And you're also going to have to raise your defenses a little bit, because Of course, everyone's least favorite part of gardening is likely the pests, and you're gonna see a little bit more of these guys. We had quite the infestation of harlequin beetles in our garden commons location this year that decimated some of our kale plants, so I can't even imagine how tedious it's going to be to take care of them next year, because of course we will only take care of our garden with organic practices on campus since it's communal, and we want all the students, everyone in the U of L community, and honestly in the greater Louisville area to be able to benefit from the fresh, healthy, organic produce. Which means the way that we deal with harlequin beetles now is to slap on some gloves and go around pinching them one by one to help hopefully reduce the population. We couldn't save them all, so we lost some kales to that battle, unfortunately. But there are also some other changes that we're going to have to account for. We're going to see both more storms and worse storms. And that is not the combo that you want to see. But we're going to notice weather events happening more often. So some areas might experience drought more frequently, and other areas might flood more often than usual. So understanding how your area is going to be impacted specifically is vital in understanding how you need to adapt your practices to accommodate for that. We're also going to see worse storms. So even if you think, oh, last year's frost wasn't too bad, it hasn't been really that bad recently, except for maybe a couple of years ago. But now it's gonna be bad, and it's gonna be harder to judge too, because again, we talked about the growing seasons lengthening. We're gonna have longer periods of time with more warmth. So now predicting when the first frost will be even harder to try to guess. And that, unfortunately for a lot of people, will likely lead to some plant loss in their gardens. We're also going to have to think about the mineral composition of the soil. And of course, another bit of a slog looking at numbers when we're talking about gardening, but understanding the ratio of the minerals and the vitamins that are available for the plants is something that's really important. It's something that, despite how many people probably really dislike math, like me, it's what's going to work best for your garden in the end. And now we're really going to have to be hitting the books, because we're going to see changes in what we thought was the best practice, because it might be for an area that becomes as warm as your area is now. Maybe your area is going to get warmer, and now suddenly some of your staple garden plants won't really like it there anymore. So I'm not saying that like you'll walk outside into your garden one day and just see your petunias with packed suitcases and they're calling a U-Haul, but plants are going to find what works best for them. And so if your city starts to grow warmer and warmer, they're going to go farther and farther north to escape that increase of heat. So what might happen is the plants that you grew every year that turned out beautifully and always thrived in your garden might not fare as well anymore, or might require an extra bit of like oomph in their caretaking to get them to that point again. Whereas if you have friends that live a few hours north, they might now have those thriving plants in their gardens instead. And so basically, the truth is that some plants might benefit from aspects of climate change. Some of these plants will enjoy the warmer environment, and there will be large swaths of land that previously couldn't grow these plants that now suddenly can. But if every plant isn't benefiting from these changes, then no plant is going to benefit from these changes, because there is a wide community and a really important symbiotic relationship between plants and natural occurrences, climate, the environment. And so what we need to understand is how, taking a look at the greater picture, really, because there will be some pros, but we can't pretend that those outweigh the many cons that we're going to be discussing. And I'm going to start off by talking about carbon fertilization. We talked about the ratio of the minerals and the important elements in the soil. Carbon is always, in just about any facet of gardening or other sciences, carbon is an absolute building block for the entirety of our existence, and it's super crucial for plants because they absorb the carbon dioxide that we put out into the atmosphere. We breathe it out and we breathe in that fresh air that the plants give us. But they're using that CO2 to photosynthesize. It's how they grow. They need it. It's like how we give our kids milk when they're itty bitty babies. They need something to help them grow and strengthen. And for plants, that's CO2. So when we're talking about climate change, a lot of people immediately point to carbon dioxide. Oh, that's one of the biggest greenhouse gases. It's the one that comes out of your car tailpipe all of the time. It's what gets emitted as we deforest. So that sounds great for plants. They're going to have an abundance of carbon. But unfortunately, that they will have an increase in available fuel, but we're going to see some changes in how that will affect their life cycle, including they're going to be retaining water more. So when you're thinking about avoiding overwatering your plants, it's going to be a little bit more of a meticulous balance now. And unfortunately, that's some bad news for me, because I always, in an overabundance of caution, overwater a plant, at least once a year probably. So who wins in this conversation? If we're talking about, there's some benefits to more carbon dioxide, there's some drawbacks too. Who wins in that conversation? Honestly, 85% of plants are going to benefit from the increased carbon fertilization. Some of these would be really big ones, including potatoes, wheat, rice, some of our most common agricultural crops. Their yields could even increase by up to 14%. But who loses? There are still a lot of really important crops to our society that are not going to benefit from this. So corn, sugarcane, sorghum, and millet, for example, they will not be able to grow more just because there's more CO2. They require a bit more maintenance to be able to get there, so this is not a win for them. So just like I talked about, we will see some benefits, but we have to acknowledge the drawbacks, and that's what's going to really do some damage. Is it even really a win for those who do fare better with more carbon dioxide? Not really. We can take a look at this image up here where I have a depiction of 6 different types of deficiency in plants. This is actually a control, so there is no deficiency here. But as we're talking about less access to some minerals, more access to others, plants might struggle with nitrogen. And that's going to lead to these really pale, almost sickly looking leaves. If they're deficient in magnesium, blotchy spots of decay will likely appear. Calcium deficiency means that we're going to get wrinkly little edges and everything's going to try to look like kale, even though it's not. And in iron deficiency, you can see some really pronounced veins on the plant here, but it mimics that nitrogen deficiency in how pale it is. And if you look carefully with a potassium deficiency, pay attention to the tips of the leaves, because we can see a little bit of a folding here that would be your giveaway. So we're seeing that around 2 billion people worldwide are already deficient in vitamins and minerals. And if the plants are reflecting these deficiencies, that means that if we were to eat them, we're not going to get all of the minerals out of them either. They already have a low mineral content, and so we're not going to get as much calcium out of these plants, as much iron or as much nitrogen as we normally would. So when we're talking about malnutrition worldwide and 2 billion people struggling to live a healthy life, talking about plants overall losing their minerals isn't going to be a positive change at all. And again, talking about the crinkling and things like that, we're going to see differences in taste and texture. And one could argue that those are livable changes, but I will say that it is extremely satisfying to bite into a crisp apple. And one of the noticeable changes could be that apples would not have that bite to them anymore. Or lettuce can be much more bitter, making salad even less enjoyable for some. Carrots would have even less of a flavor, and we're going to see a lot more deformities. And taking a quick second to remember one of the other legs of the sustainability model, the economy here, when we're talking about deformities in plants, that means that grocery stores are going to be throwing away more food, because we're seeing a rise in understanding the importance of buying ugly foods. So a soup can that's a little dented, or a tomato that's a little bit bruised. Grocery stores don't really like to sell that. If it's not picture perfect, they don't want it on their shelves. We're going to see more things being thrown away, cast aside, or just considered lower quality simply because of the way that they were grown, which is going to increase our food waste globally. And again, 2 billion people could really benefit from that. So looking at these deficiencies a little further, we can talk about a nitrogen deficiency as well. Plants are really good at maintaining their own balance of the carbon dioxide and the nutrient they have, but they maintain this a little proportionally. There's a ratio that they pay attention to and maintain. So if a plant takes in more carbon dioxide, they're also going to need more nitrogen. But that's a little easier said than done. Typically, if you have a healthy, really rich soil, that'll do the work for the plants. This is a process called nitrogen fixation, and it helps, again, fuel plant growth, but you can't necessarily manufacture that, especially not easily. You can add nitrogen to the soil, but this fixation, the way that it binds to the plants and is actually absorbed and taken in by them, is a natural process that can't exactly be replicated. One of the ways it occurs is by being struck by lightning. And so unless you've figured out how to throw a lightning bolt down, for one thing, if you do, teach me. But we can see how this is going to create even more of an issue when looking at nutrient balances. So nitrogen being able to help maintain a boost in productivity, increasing these yields, because they have more carbon dioxide, that sounds like a great benefit. Once again, oh, that sounds pretty good. But the problem is that's not going to last forever. I mentioned earlier that you might get fewer yields out of your harvest. So not only would you just obtain less in general, perhaps weight or mass wise, but you're not going to come back as frequently and get more out of these plants the way that you normally would. This boost in productivity is going to be short-lived, basically, if they can't maintain an adequate amount of nitrogen. And also, weeds grow too. When we're talking about, oh, these guys are going to get more nutrients. Oh, these guys are going to have longer lifespans. Weeds are a part of the conversation too, as much as we don't want to think about them. You will need to change your practices on how to remove weeds. They might become even more pesky and prominent than they already are. And we're also going to see them coming up in some of the least likely times. And you're going to have to, again, really check your calendars when we're trying to plan our gardens, because the growing seasons are going to change and adapt with nutrient availability, warming temperatures. So one of the big issues with this is pollination. It's one of the most crucial aspects in gardening. It is how we maintain and reproduce our plants. And unfortunately, these time clocks are going to be no longer synced up. Our bees and our bats and our mosquitoes are going to be ready to pollinate, and our plants are already going to be done for the season. They're going to have already bloomed and be dying back because they've gone through that big boost of productivity and they were lively and great, and now they're not, because that was it. They've utilized the nutrients that they had available, and so we're going to see less rates of pollination. And then we also have to talk about rain, a really important weather pattern for gardening. We're going to lose rain in some areas. Again, other gardening areas would experience more rain depending on what state you're in, what region of the world. But there are a lot of areas that are going to lose rain, or the calendar for the rain shifts as well. We're talking about the bees and the pollinators having a time clock. The plants have their own. The weather has its own. When these all work in harmony, you get a really successful, beautiful, lush garden. But when they're all out of sync, it's going to be incredibly difficult to coordinate it back into that thriving state that it was. So we're not just going to lose a little bit of rain, we're going to lose it when we need it the most. Instead of having that amount of rain be lined up with the most critical part of the growth period, it might come too late, it may come way too early. Or we might start getting frosts, ice, snow earlier than anticipated, or worse than anticipated. So what does this mean? How do we respond to this, basically? Again, a give and take. I have some good news and I have some bad news. Which would we like first? I like to start with the bad news. So unfortunately, these changes are going to mean that the invasive species populations, pest populations, they're going to be growing more and more. They're not going to really struggle in the face of these temperatures because a lot of pests prefer a warmer climate. So knowing that they're going to have a longer warm period, they're a little excited about that. And of course, like we talked about just a moment ago, weeds are going to do the same. Weeds are going to go through that boost of productivity and show up and be there and be present, and their populations are going to fare pretty well unless you are able to just completely stay on top of it, which likely you will be, but man, it's going to take a little bit more work than it should. And these plants are going to require more water, like we talked about. Some areas where you're already struggling with a water shortage, this is really bad news. But there's a couple good pieces of news. We have longer growing seasons, and that is going to allow for more diverse growing. So biodiversity is incredibly important in maintaining a balanced ecosystem, so it's possible to use the longer growing seasons to your advantage. And you could get multiple harvests out of the same plot, especially rotating the crops, because you have that longer period of time. So when your first set of crops and gardening plants kind of retire for the season, you can cycle in a different one, which will help maintain the nutrient levels in the soil instead of just putting in one plant that might be super nitrogen hungry. If you put in another plant right after that that's also nitrogen hungry, or stay with the same plant, nitrogen hungry, you're not going to have any nitrogen left because they're going to have feasted on that. So it's important to switch when you're maintaining a field. And we could already see these changes happening, unfortunately. So just about 50 years ago, the spring frost came about 1 to 2 days late, and the fall frost would show up about 1 or 2 days earlier. But now, 50 years later, we're seeing that the fall frost is late by almost an entire week. And the spring frost is also about 6 days late. That's a big shift. You can see the huge divergence in these lines. The orange one representing our fall frost and the yellow one representing our spring frost. They do a complete switch during this period between basically the 40s and the 80s. They cross over each other twice, in fact, and now have diverged more than they have over the last 100 years, actually. 100, we go all the way back to 1890 on this data set, and we can see all the way up to 2020. This divergence is wider than we've seen throughout history. And also, some of these changes are more drastic than others. Some areas are going to get hit really hard. Other areas, it might just be a normal Tuesday. So we do have some states that have already started to experience a shorter growing season, but we've seen more who have drastic increases in their growing season length. So if we take a look, Georgia is just about the only one that is in sort of the brown zone. So that's showing that their growing season has decreased by a couple of days, but these dark green areas are where we're seeing really long growing seasons, much longer than usual. And with how dark that green is, that's almost 45 days longer than what the average growing period would be. How are the plants responding to this, though? Because obviously, if we're seeing these changes, they're going to be reacting to them. So plants want to live in the climates that they're already adjusted to. This is, again, your petunias getting a U-Haul to get out of here, basically, because if it gets too warm, they're not going to like it. But this change, this movement doesn't happen fast because they can't just grow legs and walk away. They have to move their population slowly and steadily, and plants rely on, a lot of times, external factors to spread their populations. The seeds get eaten by birds and get transported, or they blow away in the wind and make it to newer destinations. It's just that they're really pushing these destinations farther north so they don't have to deal with the heat as much. And so when we take a look at this map here, this is showing a difference in the types of primarily trees that are throughout the United States. Taking a look at this one, this is a map of the 1960s to the 1990s. So we see a lot of this red area. That's maple trees, that's beeches, that's birches, and also a lot of this sort of salmon and pink color throughout. And that's our elm, ash, and cottonwood populations. This dark blue here as well around our Bible Belt, that's the loblolly shortleaf pines. So we've got a really colorful graph here, a nice little almost striation of our colors. But then we look at our projected future map, and it's a lot more one note. The entirety of Pennsylvania is now absorbed by the oak and hickory populations. We see a lot more of the oak and pines as well, and I love an oak tree. They're beautiful, but what this is telling us is we're going to lose a lot of our biodiversity, and that's going to make a lot of these environments unlivable for some really important species. You can see that almost the entirety of the maple, beech, and birch populations are expected to just disappear from the New England area. And also, our pests are responding. If the plants are going to pick up the phone, the pests are going to do the same. We're talking about 40% of our food crops being lost to pests already every year. So they're going to love the new conditions, basically. As it starts to warm, it starts to rain more, their populations are really going to thrive, and they're going to be able to spread as well. Two of our really prominent actors in this conversation are going to be southern blight and Japanese beetles. These are already two really pesky diseases or pests that gardeners will have to deal with, and they are going to definitely benefit from the increase in temperatures. Their populations are going to be able to withstand conditions in more areas than they already are, especially as areas get more warm and more humid, because of course, and it's the same with humans as well, bacteria, diseases really thrive in those warm, wet environments. Fungi do as well. So we're going to see increases in like our mushroom populations, even our molds as well, though. Again, another give and take. And we're going to be seeing a movement of our hardiness zone. So of course, hardiness is the basically natural conditions for each area. Like I've been saying, your climate's going to change and it'll get warmer. So we're seeing a bit of a shift in the heat and what can and can't really live in these areas. The hardiness zones are typically defined by their average low temperatures. And so as you move to different zones, the difference between hardiness zone 6 and hardiness zone 7, for example, is about a 10-degree difference in terms of our low points. When we take a look at this when we take a look at this map, we can see that this is the difference between 1990 and 2015. So not an extremely large span of time, seeing the differences in how the hardiness zones have changed. You can see that almost the entirety of Kentucky has experienced an entire zone change. So that means our average lows have moved up by a whopping 10 degrees in the span of 25 years. That gives you a bit of a scope on how long and how fast these processes are going to take. And this is another map from the Arbor Day Foundation depicting these changes. So we can see on the 1990 map, again, Kentucky almost completely absorbed as a number 6 zone at that point. But once we moved over to 2015, now it's entirely yellow. It's moved up to a hardiness zone 7. And that can greatly change what populations are considered to be viable in those areas. And just in case you couldn't see Kentucky from here. So what do we do now? This is going to really change the game for how gardening is done. And so I'd like to propose a couple of solutions, some adaptations that we can take into consideration as we move forward. And of course, choose plants wisely. It's something that we all already do anyways. You can't just decide to plant a garden and buy whatever you want and have it work out perfectly. I've learned the hard way that as the trees in my front yard have grown, I have almost 100% shade. So I need to buy plants that will really only live in 100% shade. And that's not really a lot of them. So how else can we make sure that our plants can sort of survive as our areas change? Compost is going to be really helpful. We have an initiative through the University of Louisville and the city of Louisville as well called the Louisville Compost Co-op. And so we actually practice vermiculture on campus to help create this really rich soil using the worms to sort of help break down these materials and introduce more nutrients to the soil. And I highly encourage anyone who doesn't already practice composting to take a look into it. I know there's a lot of misconceptions. It can sometimes even be controversial. I know a lot of people don't really want to have a compost bin sitting on their kitchen counter, especially because of the smell. But when you maintain an accurate balance of your organic materials, so your food waste and scraps like that, with your brown materials, which would be paper or cardboard, it reduces that smell a lot because it'll just naturally have that correct ratio and won't need to create that smell, as the brown material can kind of cool down the organic material and keep them both in check. And this is going to also provide some really nutritious soil for your gardens. So it's a good way to reduce your food waste and put it to good use. And it's a good way to give your plants a helping hand. And again, I mentioned crop rotation earlier. If that's not something you already practice, you might have to start looking into it depending on how much your area has changed. So if you use the same plot for different plants, this can help maintain the nutrient levels in the soil. This can help reduce the risk of infestation, because if you leave one plant population in an area for too long, it makes it easier for diseases to spread and develop, for pest populations to move in, get settled and spread. So crop rotation is going to be even more common practice, I believe. Right now, it's typically utilized in agriculture, but we might want to start considering it for our residential gardening as well, rotating within the same season even. And then also continuing to use lawn alternatives. And so maintaining a garden, you're already sort of doing that, because a lawn alternative is basically anything but normal grass. So not turf. Let me be clear. I do not mean turf. What I mean when I say lawn alternatives is wildflowers. It's pollinator gardens. It's ground cover. It's not just a normal suburban lawn that is going to be incredibly thirsty for all the water in your neighborhood and isn't just a monoculture. We want to see biodiversity in our lawns, because that's how we bring in and protect and maintain our pollinator populations. That's how we maintain nutrient levels and help combat some of the changes that we're going to see. We really need to work on maintaining our biodiversity within our own gardens and within our greater communities as well, because we're not going to be able to just form our own individual bubbles and protect our own gardens. So I appreciate you all being here today. This is a brief or abbreviated version of the presentation. I really appreciate your patience. Thank you so much for being here today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can either reach out to me through email or you can drop them in the comment section below. Thank you so much for attending, and have a beautiful today and a great To-Yarrow.